but they had to get rid of what they originally wanted to destroy in that blast.
That's why we had reports of people carrying a lot of stuff out of the building.
Yes. I can tell you the real reasons why they bombed that building, if you'd like.
I would like, yes. Why the bombing?
I have to go back through just a little bit of history so listeners can understand, because this is very, very important to our country. Okay, so if you go back to January of 1991, that was the Gulf War. Previous to that war, Saddam Hussein, he was a CIA asset. He had been engaged in a war with Iran, and Iran had enjoyed a 10-to-1 infantry advantage. And we were always worried about the Iranians overrunning our asset, Saddam.
Uh-huh.
And so we secretly, covertly in the Reagan administration, we armed Saddam with the Ames strain of anthrax, and that came out of Fort Detrick, Maryland. It had a small spore size and a different protein code. It's a weaponized version of anthrax, which would be more readily absorbed. And so we gave them that covertly. He never used it. When he invaded Kuwait, we had to demonize him and stop him. The Saudis were putting a lot of pressure on us, so we went in there in Desert Storm and went to remove him from Kuwait. And our Pentagon, they were all afraid that he would use that Ames strain of anthrax on our own troops. I'm going to try to go through this, and it's just a little background. We'll get to the
This is fascinating.
They didn't want to admit to the American people they'd given them this stuff. And now that we were going in there, they had to come up with a vaccine of our troops. It's normally a 6-month injection, course of injections where you take one shot per month. And we didn't have time to wait 6 months. They created a new vaccine that went 1 month, and they got Bioport and some of these other companies to make it. They waived FDA approval. They hurried our troops through there. They gave them these shots. The first lot went to Dover Air Force Base. The pilots were all getting sick. This new thing had squalene in it. It's an adjunct. It's an autoimmune booster, very similar to the Therasol, which is a mercury-based thing in the flu shots, or the aluminum. Yeah.
Wow, this is mind-boggling what you're telling us, Cody. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so now they gave this new vaccine to our troops. It was untested. And it led to what was generally called the Gulf War syndrome. People were getting sick.
Yeah.
Nobody knew why. And then the second thing that happened in that war, that was the very first time our military had ever used depleted uranium weapons in a war. And we expended approximately 200 tons of it, primarily in the A-10 Warthog tank buster jets that use a 30-millimeter chain guns.
Uh-huh.
And they used depleted uranium-238. Our M1A1 Abrams tanks, which, by the way, Tim McVeigh was a tank commander in Desert Storm. He won a Bronze Star for confirmed kills.
Mm-hmm.
But those M1A1 Abrams tanks had sabot rounds in them. And they had about an 8 or 9 inch rod of depleted uranium-238 inside of them. And they had a very high kinetic energy, about 5,200 feet per second. Those rounds hit Soviet tanks. They had enough kinetic energy to blow an 11-ton turret just clean off. Saddam was using those T-54 Soviet tanks. And a brand new thing happened that had never happened in war before. And this depleted uranium cloud, this explosion was forming new compounds like uranium dioxide. When these particulates settled down, the micron size of them were 4 millimeters. Now, our standard military mop gear, the filters on them only went down to 10 microns. So our troops began breathing this low-level radioactive particulates, and they went through the filters, and they accumulate in the human body in 2 basic places, in the thyroid glands and in the ovaries if you're a woman, or the testicles if you're a man.
Oh, my God.
Now, when our troops started coming back from Desert Storm,
mm-hmm.
they were sick from the squalene adjuncts in these new experimental anthrax vaccines, and they were also carrying inside of them low levels of depleted uranium. Now, what do soldiers do when they get back home? You know, they see their wives and they make love and have children. And what the Pentagon was worried about, this is the first time this ever happened, the semen in the men had radiation in them, and they were being transferred into
mm-hmm.
the women.
Sure.
They were getting sick. The children were getting sick and having failure to thrive syndrome is what the Air Force called it. And the Pentagon, Jeff, they didn't know how many generations this sickness was going to be transferred. And so they potentially had on their hand hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars of long-range medical bills. And so a few years after the war, 1994, there was Chris Shays. He was a senator on an Armed Services Committee from Connecticut. And he was tasked with determining medical culpability for the Gulf War syndrome of all our troops. We had approximately 480 troops in all the branches of service coming back, and a lot of them were sick. I know, Jeff, you've heard about that Agent Orange thing and the big DuPont settlement. Well, this was something potentially bigger. And so Senator Shays said, we need to determine medical culpability, and we're going to request the FBI to gather all the records of these people. So we'll have medical files, and we can give them money. Well, guess where the medical files were stored?
Oh, no. Oh, this is sickening. God.
In the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. Now, I got one more bombshell here. So let's just think about that for a minute. I mean, think about what's going on here. It's a Pentagon cover-up. The MOP gear was defective. Our troops got sick from that depleted uranium.
This is unbelievable.
Yeah, they called it Gulf War syndrome, and
sure.
laid it off.
Yeah.
They laid it off on Saddam burning. You know, he lit those oil wells in Kuwait on fire and all this other stuff.
Well, we supposedly blew up some of his chem weapons dumps, too. It's all crap.
And so when all those medical records went away, in the Murrah building blast, so there was a hearing later on in September the 19th of 1996. This was a congressional hearing on Gulf War syndrome after the Murrah building records had been lost. And at that hearing, the DOD admitted under oath at the hearing that over 400,000 Gulf War syndrome records of our veterans had, quote, disappeared. So without the record, they didn't give out the money. Meanwhile, our guys were getting sick. Now, you want to hear the second reason why the Murrah building was blown up?
That's bad enough. Go ahead. Jesus.
Yeah, well, that's what happened. That's why they ordered that op. The second one has to do with corruption of Mr. Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton. And this went back to Centaur Rose, Screwworm. They were three multiply nested ops in Arkansas back in 82, 83, 84, 85. And to make a long story short, we were arming the Nicaraguans with a lot of weapons. And Barry Seal was a contract pilot, CIA. He had been in the 20th Special Forces group back in Fort Benning in 63, took his training, went to Vietnam as a pilot, came back, and accepted CIA ops in Arkansas. And he was running the Mena Airport there with a front company called Rich Mountain Aviation. And so they were all bringing the cocaine back to pay for this. And they were running approximately $100 million a month in coke through there. My sources told me that Bill Clinton and them were getting about $10 million a month, 10% of the op money. And he later used that money to go run for president. But anyway, there had been a large contingent of law enforcement agencies that had gotten wind of the CIA covert operations there in around Mena, and the Arkansas Bureau of Investigation, the state police, the DEA, the IRS. They were laundering this money through the banks in Little Rock and the Worthington Bank in Atlanta, which was sent overseas to the Caymans at a bank called the BCCI. That's a Bank of Commerce and Credit.
Oh, yeah, BCCI. Oh, I know. I remember that.
Yeah. And so, all this ties into this stuff all later on. But anyway, to make a long story short, they had a lot of law enforcement records there, okay? And they were all being stored in the FBI office in Little Rock. Prior to the Murrah building bombing, there was a police detective in Tulsa, where I used to work, named Craig Roberts. He got a call from an FBI agent who would not give his name, and he told him that all those law enforcement records had just been moved to the Murrah building. And so when it blew up, all those records that could have been used to indict Bill and Hillary Clinton, they were all gone. And you remember in July 26th of 1994, that's when the Whitewater investigation began. And then in August of 1994, that's when Ken Starr, you remember him?
Sure do.
he was appointed to as the Whitewater prosecutor to replace that Fisk that Janet Reno had appointed. See, so Clinton had got Janet Reno as U.S. attorney, and then they appointed Fisk to help cover all this Whitewater stuff up.
Yeah.
And that's why they put Ken Starr in there, because they knew the investigation had been rigged. So this whole thing gets real deep, and we have a lot of detail in the book.
Where is the book available, Cody? I've got to give that information out.
Yeah, well, I just have to explain, Jeff, this book is different from a lot of books. Most people that write a book, they go to a publisher, they get it published, and then they go out and start doing interviews. This book was about black ops, and I was afraid about writing and exposing things. I had to do everything the opposite. I couldn't approach a publisher with this because I was afraid they'd rat me out to the CIA, and then they'd shut the whole thing down. So what we have to do is interviews first, the book later. What we have now is CD copies, edit copies, and we're under negotiation with several publishers for the rights to the book. But we do have some available through my website for people who want.
All right, please give that information out now. I'll tell you right now, this is without question one of the most important books of my professional career I have ever come across. And he said this goes deep. This really exposes the whole horror of the Clintons, the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein. My God, the depleted. I was on the depleted uranium story very early on, Cody.
People can contact me there. We'll tell them how to get the book there. All right, my email is CODY, Cody, Golden, GOLDEN, ELK, ELK, @yahoo.com.
Got it.
Cody Golden Elk. I'm part Cherokee Indian, and that's my Indian name is Cody Golden Elk.
What can these people do who have been contaminated, who are dying right now? They're still radioactive. This stuff doesn't go away. That's not the way it works. In that the government would never even admit that these people had been dosed with radioactivity. What could the VA do, even if it wanted to, without assuming liability and exposing the government to full liability?